In the quiet communities of Greater Manchester, Harold Shipman was more than just a doctor. He was a symbol of trust and compassion, a figure who seemed to embody the very essence of care that patients longed for. For years, he was known as a dedicated general practitioner, one who made house calls, listened attentively, and appeared profoundly committed to the well-being of those under his care. Elderly patients and their families often described him as so wonderful, a steadfast presence in their lives during times of vulnerability and illness. This image, painstakingly cultivated and sincerely believed by many, laid the foundation for an unassailable trust that would ultimately become his greatest weapon. But beneath this trusted public persona lurked a sinister truth. Harold Shipman was one of the most prolific serial killers in history, a man who betrayed the sacred oath of his profession and the fundamental trust placed in a doctor by his patients. Over nearly 3 decades, and under the cloak of medical authority, Shipman is believed to have murdered approximately 250 of his own patients, most of them elderly, many in good health moments before his lethal intervention. His killings were not the random acts of a desperate individual, but the calculated maneuvers of a predator who exploited the very systems designed to protect and care for the vulnerable. The chilling contrast between the caring family doctor and the cold-blooded murderer is central to understanding the depth of Shipman's crimes. The doctor-patient relationship is founded on an inherent trust, a faith that the person responsible for your health and survival will act in your best interest, never as an agent of harm. Shipman perverted this trust, weaponizing it to grant himself unparalleled access and control over his patients' lives and deaths. Unlike other serial killers who prey on strangers, Shipman's victims invited him into their homes and lives, often in their final moments, believing in his expertise and compassion. This exploitation of systemic trust, especially in the close-knit context of a community reliant on general practitioners as lifelong caregivers, transformed him into a grim figure who shattered the very heart of communal security and safety. For much of his criminal career, the idea that a doctor could systematically kill patients was inconceivable, unthinkable even. The notion ran counter to societal expectations and professional stereotypes so deeply ingrained that suspicions around Shipman were initially dismissed, overlooked, or rationalized away. The medical profession, along with society at large, balked at the possibility that one of their own could be responsible for such horror. This psychological barrier of unthinkability allowed Shipman to evade detection for decades, as colleagues, authorities, and the public hesitated to confront the terrifying reality. Shipman's crimes represent a profound breach of trust that goes beyond individual acts of violence. They illuminate the dark vulnerabilities inherent in medical systems. His methodology exploited routine practices, home visits, death certifications, and patient records to cloak his murders in the guise of natural deaths. By falsifying death certificates and medical histories, he manipulated legal and medical protocols designed to verify and honor the truth of death, turning regulatory frameworks into shields for his malevolence. This opening chapter of Shipman's story sets the tone for the grim exploration ahead. It is a tale of dual faces, the healer who brought comfort and hope, and the killer who extinguished life with quiet cruelty. The narrative invites us to grapple with uncomfortable questions about trust, power, and the potential for evil hidden in plain sight within treasured institutions. In understanding the eerie dichotomy of Harold Shipman, the trusted doctor and the determined murderer, we come face to face with one of the darkest betrayals in modern history, a shocking testament to how systemic faith can be manipulated for unthinkable ends. Harold Frederick Shipman's story begins in the post-war industrial city of Nottingham, England, where he was born in 1946 to modest beginnings. The son of a lorry driver, his early life by most accounts was unremarkable and outwardly ordinary, devoid of dramatic incidents or red flags. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy lay significant experiences that would ultimately become pivotal to understanding the man who would one day be known as Britain's most prolific serial killer. One of the most profoundly formative moments in Shipman's early years was the death of his mother, Vera, when he was just 17 years old. She succumbed to lung cancer, and in his teenage years, as he prepared for his A-level exams, Shipman was intimately involved in her care during her slow and painful decline. Witnessing firsthand the administration of morphine to ease her suffering, This early exposure to the finality of death and the power of medically controlled substances planted deep psychological seeds. The experience marked a haunting intersection of care, pain relief, and death, a triad that would later echo darkly through his adult life and crimes. During his time at Leeds University Medical School, where he enrolled after finishing school, Shipman blended quietly into the background, earning the nickname Fred among his peers for his unremarkable and compliant demeanor. It was here that he met Primrose Oxtoby, whom he married and with whom he had 4 children. His early medical education and personal life appeared conventional and stable, a foundation that might have promised a typical career in medicine. Shipman qualified as a doctor in 1970, beginning his professional journey as a junior doctor at Pontefract General Infirmary in West Yorkshire. But this period, stretching from 1970 to 1974, would, in retrospect, be the earliest phase of his sinister trajectory. The Shipman inquiry, launched after his crimes were uncovered, later concluded that his killing spree may have already begun during these formative years in the hospital wards, with at least 2 deaths definitively linked to him, and suspicions surrounding several others. This revelation casts a chilling new light on the transition between his medical training and his first professional roles. Far from being an innocent novice, Shipman had seemingly embarked on a dark path early in his career. In 1974, Shipman entered general practice, taking up a post at the Abraham Ormerod Medical Center in Todmorden. It was here that troubling warning signs started to emerge. Between 1975 and 1976, Shipman developed a dependency on the powerful opioid painkiller pethidine. His addiction led him to commit a series of forgeries to obtain the drug illicitly, falsifying patient prescriptions to supply himself. His actions were eventually uncovered, leading to a court case where he was convicted on multiple counts of prescription fraud and illegal drug acquisition. Yet despite the seriousness of these offenses, the repercussions were surprisingly lenient: a £600 fine, a referral for psychiatric treatment aimed at addressing his addiction, and a warning from the General Medical Council (GMC), but crucially, not removal from the medical register. This period was critical in understanding how systemic failures allowed Shipman's dark impulses to go unchecked. Psychiatric assessments had concluded that Shipman posed no danger to his patients and was unlikely to relapse, assessments that would tragically prove catastrophically wrong. The police, including Detective Sergeant George McKeating, who was involved in the investigation, held grave concerns about Shipman's suitability to continue practicing medicine. However, these warnings were inadequately acted upon, in part due to the GMC's apparent inclination to protect medical professionals over public welfare, a judgment later condemned as a grave error by the Shipman inquiry. This institutional leniency handed Shipman the opportunity to continue his medical career and, unwittingly, facilitated his chilling future crimes. After his conviction for drug-related offenses, Shipman briefly served as a clinical medical officer in southwest Durham before relocating in 1977 to Hyde, Cheshire, where he would work at Donnybrook House Group practice. This move allowed him to rebuild and continue his medical career, but it also marked the beginning of the darkest phase of his life, the transformation from a doctor struggling with addiction to a methodical and prolific killer. Descriptions from colleagues during his early years in Hyde included references to violent mood swings and difficult behavior, factors which may have contributed to his eventual decision in 1992 to leave the group practice and establish himself as a single-handed GP. This shift to solo practice proved instrumental in enabling the unmonitored and unfettered expansion of his malevolent activities. Looking back, the early years of Harold Shipman's life and career offer a stark contrast between the outwardly mundane and the profoundly disturbing. From a seemingly typical upbringing, through the trauma of his mother's death and his subsequent exposure to powerful opiates in that context, to his initial steps into the medical profession shadowed by addiction and criminal behavior, these formative experiences underscore the psychological complexity driving his darkest urges. The early noted signs, the drug addiction, the forgeries, and the missed regulatory red flags, highlight both individual pathology and systemic failures that together created fertile ground for his crimes to unfold. These missed warning signs, overlooked or dismissed by the medical governance structures, allowed a dangerous man to slip through the cracks, setting a grim precedent for the horrors yet to come. As we move beyond his early shadows, we begin to glimpse how these foundational experiences, loss, control, addiction, and deception, intertwined to forge a chilling obsession with life and death. A man who had once witnessed morphine's role at the bedside of his dying mother would come to wield similar drugs as tools of calculated murder. The seeds planted in his youth grew into a deadly obsession, masked by the trust placed in him as a healer, a trust that he would ultimately and irrevocably betray. This exploration of Shipman's early life and medical beginnings alerts us to the profound human and systemic vulnerabilities at the root of this tragedy. Understanding these formative shadows is critical as we delve deeper into the trajectory of his crimes and the impact they wrought upon the communities he served. In 1977, Harold Shipman made a pivotal professional move that would mark the darkest chapter of his life and career. Relocating to Hyde, Cheshire, he transitioned from hospital and group practice roles into general practice within this close-knit community. This move was not just a change of address or workplace, it was the beginning of what would become the most intense and horrifying period of his killings. At first, Shipman joined the Donnybrook House group practice in Hyde, but his time there was fraught with interpersonal challenges. Colleagues described him as volatile, marked by violent mood swings that ultimately made the group partnership unsustainable. By 1992, Shipman chose to leave the group practice entirely and set up a single-handed GP practice at 21 Market Street, Hyde. This transition to a solo practice represented a decisive turning point that effectively removed layers of oversight and peer supervision. Freed from the watchful eyes of colleagues, Shipman now operated in an environment of alarming autonomy, where minimal external scrutiny paved the way for his murderous activities to escalate dramatically. This period saw a chilling intensification of patient deaths under his care. The solitary nature of his practice meant fewer checks on his prescribing habits or the frequency and circumstances of his patients' deaths. Shipman leveraged this isolation to leverage his dark impulses with a creeping boldness, and statistical patterns revealed a grim truth. The number of deaths within his patient group soared after 1992. The environment he created was fertile ground for a predator cloaked in the respectability and trust inherent to his profession. Shipman's method of murder was deceptively simple yet profoundly sinister. His weapon of choice was diamorphine, a potent opioid analgesic used legitimately in medical practice, often for pain relief in palliative care. Shipman administered lethal doses during routine home visits, an act that further exploited the deeply ingrained trust his patients and their families placed in him. Home visits granted Shipman privacy, shielding his fatal actions from witnesses and immediate suspicion. Occasionally, the murders also took place in his surgery itself, but it was his quiet, almost casual administration of lethal injections in the intimate spaces of his patients' homes that underscored the chilling breach of trust. After the fatal injection, Shipman took elaborate steps to conceal his crimes. As the attending doctor, he was uniquely positioned to sign death certificates, which he completed with calculated ease. He consistently attributed deaths to natural causes, typically listing conditions plausible for elderly or vulnerable patients. Shipman did not stop there. He forged medical documents retrospectively, inserting fabricated symptoms and medical histories into patient records to make the death certificates appear legitimate. His use of digital medical records, while seen as modern and efficient at the time, became his undoing later, as timestamps and changelogs betrayed his manipulations. This testimony to his arrogance suggested a belief that he could outsmart the system indefinitely, underestimating the forensic capabilities of investigators who followed. The profile of Shipman's victims reveals a disturbing pattern that speaks to his manipulative psyche. The majority were elderly individuals, predominantly women, who lived alone and depended heavily on Shipman's care. The Shipman inquiry identified 171 female victims out of 215 confirmed murders, a stark testament to his targeting of a vulnerable demographic. Many of these victims were in reasonably good health before their sudden deaths, defying assumptions that they were merely terminally ill or near the natural end of life. This preference for otherwise healthy elderly women highlights the cruel exploitation of not just physical frailty, but of profound trust and societal assumptions about age and death. Shipman preyed upon the isolation and dependency that often accompany old age, leveraging his position as a trusted family doctor to gain intimate access to his victims in their own homes. Such trust granted him not only physical access but also an emotional and psychological grip on those under his care, making his betrayals all the more wrenching. This selection was not random. It served as a calculated exploitation of societal blind spots. The elderly were socially vulnerable, their deaths too easily accepted as natural decline, a cover under which Shipman hid his horrifying deeds. The period following Shipman's transition to solo practice saw a rapid and chilling escalation in the frequency of his killings. Estimates place at least 143 of his victims as having been murdered after 1992, the year he took sole control of his practice. Statistical analysis from the mid-1990s revealed a significant spike in mortality rates among his patients, notably so around 1995 and beyond. By 1996, on average, Shipman was killing roughly 30 patients a year, and this rose to approximately 37 in 1997, translating to nearly one death every 10 days. This swift acceleration was not just a matter of quantity. It revealed a disturbing boldness, a compulsive momentum that seemed to override concerns for concealment. This surge in killing activity may also reflect a psychological unraveling or deepening compulsion, a loss of control masked by a professional facade. To the outside world and most of his victims, Shipman maintained the guise of a devoted, caring doctor, earning praise for his compassionate home visits and commitment to patient welfare. Yet, survivors and acquaintances occasionally saw another side, an arrogant, cold, sometimes nasty man prone to mood swings and dismissiveness. These conflicting portraits, the publicly admired physician and a privately cruel man, paint a complex psychological profile, one marked by duplicity and emotional dissonance. These dual natures, the charming healer juxtaposed with a remorseless killer, illustrate the profound contradictions at the heart of Shipman's personality, a chilling Jekyll and Hyde figure who thrived on deception. As this dark chapter in Hyde unfolded, Shipman's mastery of manipulation and exploitation of systemic vulnerabilities allowed him to continue his killings under an uncrackable veneer of normality. The stability, trust, and privacy that characterized the doctor's role in a community became the very mechanisms that enabled his reign of terror. His meticulous falsification of records and official documents, combined with strategic use of home visits, constituted a uniquely lethal and invasive method of murder. The insight into Harold Shipman's rise to power and reign of terror in Hyde serves as a sobering examination of how trust can be weaponized and how systemic gaps and professional isolation can be exploited by those with dark intentions. It highlights the fragility of safeguards when balanced against an individual's capacity for malevolence, especially within roles so intrinsically bound to trust and authority. With the horrifying reign in Hyde laid bare, we are prompted to reflect on the chilling ease with which Shipman betrayed not only individual patients but the very institution and community that welcomed him with open arms. This section sets the stage for examining the unraveling of his crimes, as small, perceptible cracks would eventually widen, revealing the full, ghastly extent of his betrayal and murder. The next chapter in this story turns to the pivotal moment that began his exposure, the final act that shattered the silence surrounding the Doctor of Death. In the summer of 1998, a crucial turning point emerged in the harrowing saga of Harold Shipman, the trusted doctor whose dark deeds stunned a nation. This moment came with the death of Kathleen Grundy, an energetic and respected widow, whose passing would ultimately unveil the horrifying extent of Shipman's crimes and set in motion a dramatic quest for truth and justice. Kathleen Grundy was far from the typical victim. At 81 years old, she was a former mayoress of Hyde, a woman of prominence and vitality. Her death on June 24, 1998, seemed at first to be a natural event, a quiet end attributed to old age by the very doctor who had cared for her. Shipman himself was the last person to see her alive that day, and he swiftly signed her death certificate without recommending an autopsy, further deepening the veneer of normalcy surrounding her passing. But this death was different, and Shipman's fatal misstep lay not solely in the act of killing but in the aftermath, a brazen and clumsy act of greed that would unravel his carefully constructed facade. Shortly after Mrs. Grundy's death, a will surfaced that left her entire substantial estate, valued at nearly £400,000, not to her daughter or family, but to Shipman himself. This was a blatant deviation from prior arrangements, and the document was riddled with red flags, crudely typed, clumsily signed, and evidently forged. The typewriter used to produce this fraudulent will was later found in Shipman's own home, casting a dark shadow over his intentions. This ill-advised act of forgery was unlike Shipman's usually silent wickedness. For years, the killings had been buried in the shadows, hidden behind medical authority and the guise of natural deaths. The forged will was a tangible, reckless exposure of his crimes. It was a fatal error, one that suggested a possible subconscious desire on Shipman's part to be discovered, or perhaps an overconfidence in his own invincibility. Whatever the motive, this forgery served as the spark that ignited a full-scale investigation. At the heart of this unfolded drama was Angela Woodruff, Kathleen Grundy's daughter. Angela was no ordinary grieving family member. As a solicitor who had long managed her mother's legal and financial affairs, she was uniquely equipped to recognize the irregularity of this new will. Where others might have accepted the document at face value, Angela immediately questioned its authenticity. With a blend of professional acuity and personal conviction, she refused to let her mother's death be quietly erased or exploited. Angela's suspicion was not born of mere intuition. It was grounded in legal knowledge, intimate understanding, and an unyielding commitment to uncovering the truth. She raised her concerns with the local police, setting in motion what would become the unraveling of Shipman's murderous reign. Her determination to seek justice in the face of entrenched trust and institutional inertia was instrumental, shining a beacon of vigilant courage in what had been a dark and long night for the community. The police investigation that followed was relentless. The exhumation of Kathleen Grundy's body revealed a lethal overdose of morphine administered within the timeframe of Shipman's last visit. The forensic evidence confirmed what Angela had long suspected. Her mother was not a victim of natural causes, but of a calculated, cold-blooded murder. The discovery of the forged will and the typewriter in Shipman's possession further corroborated the narrative of deceit and greed. This turning point was a stark reminder of the power of accountability and the invaluable role that watchful, determined family members can play in unmasking deception. Where medical professionals and authorities had previously missed or dismissed warning signs, Angela Woodruff's persistence cut through the veil of silence and disbelief. In exposing the forged will and challenging the suspicious circumstances of her mother's death, she forced the system to confront its failures and initiate a wider inquiry. The consequences were profound. Angela's courage directly led to investigative efforts that identified irregularities in Shipman's medical records and revealed a pattern of falsification and murder extending far beyond her mother. Her challenge to the forged will was more than a fight over an inheritance. It was a crucial act of justice that pulled back the curtain on one of the most chilling serial killings in modern history. Kathleen Grundy's death marked the beginning of the end for Harold Shipman. It was a fatal mistake, born of greed and arrogance, that shattered the secrecy he had so carefully maintained. And at the heart of this revelation was a daughter's unwavering resolve, a powerful testament to the human spirit's ability to confront evil through truth and determination. As the investigation grew, so too did the understanding of the magnitude of Shipman's crimes. The forged will was the key that unlocked a door that had long been sealed, setting into motion a chain of events that would bring a trusted healer's darkest deeds to light. From this pivotal moment, the narrative shifts from quiet suspicion to active pursuit. The quiet shadows begin to recede, exposing the full horror of a betrayal not only of a family or a community, but of the very essence of trust itself. Kathleen Grundy's death, and Angela Woodruff's determined fight for justice, stand as a reminder that vigilance and courage are vital weapons against deception, and that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, the truth can prevail. This confrontation with truth paved the way for the investigation that would ultimately bring Harold Shipman to justice, revealing a chilling legacy of death and deceit. It underscores that behind the veil of authority and trust, evil can thrive, but it can also be confronted and overcome through relentless commitment and courage. The story of Kathleen Grundy and Angela Woodruff is indelibly woven into the tapestry of this case, exemplifying the profound impact that one person's vigilant resolve can have in the pursuit of justice. The case of Harold Shipman is a chilling reminder of how evil can hide behind the most trusted facades, But the path to his arrest was marred by mischances and investigative shortcomings that prolonged his reign of terror. As we turn to the closing net that finally ensnared this notorious killer, it's essential to understand both the early warnings ignored and the determined efforts that led to his eventual downfall in September 1998. For years, subtle signs and troubling patterns flickered around Shipman's practice, yet few acted decisively. Local undertakers, who had an unusual vantage point on death in Hyde, observed an unnerving increase in the number of Shipman's patients dying. They noted the odd circumstances. Often the deceased were fully dressed and found sitting comfortably on a settee or chair, passed away during the day rather than in the night hours when natural deaths might be expected. This unusual pattern raised questions, and one concerned undertaker even approached Shipman to voice these observations. But Shipman, with practiced ease, dispelled the worries, assuring them nothing was amiss. Within the medical community, unease also simmered. In early 1998, Dr. Susan Booth, a fellow general practitioner working nearby, grew increasingly alarmed. She noticed not just an abnormal number of deaths among Shipman's patients, particularly elderly women, but also the frequency with which Shipman requested counter-signatures on cremation forms, a procedural irregularity hinting that something was not right. Dr. Booth raised her concerns with the local coroner, John Pollard, hoping to trigger scrutiny. This was no small matter. For a trusted GP's patients to die in such numbers and under suspicious procedural circumstances should have warranted urgent investigation. Yet, these early warnings sank into inertia, a tragic consequence of the prevailing mindset that medical doctors were inherently beyond such malevolent suspicion. The barrier of unthinkability, the difficulty of imagining a doctor as a murderer, clouded judgment and delayed action. When police finally undertook an initial inquiry in March 1998, just months before Shipman's arrest, they faltered. The investigation was constrained by inexperience, with officers unfamiliar with the complexities of medical malpractice and who lacked critical investigative rigor. Crucially, they never contacted the General Medical Council to check Shipman's professional history. Had they would have uncovered his prior conviction for drug forgery in the mid-1970s, a glaring red flag never acted upon. This cursory investigation closed without arrest, allowing Shipman to strike again, claiming at least 3 more victims before his final apprehension. It was only following the death of Kathleen Grundy, Shipman's wealthy former mayor victim, that the net truly began to tighten. Her daughter, Angela Woodruff, a solicitor well-versed in legal affairs, challenged the legitimacy of a suspiciously forged will that named Shipman as the sole beneficiary, excluding her own family entirely. This discovery gave investigators a tangible lead, transforming vague suspicions into a concrete, prosecutable fraud case. The forged will was a vital crack in Shipman's carefully constructed facade. Prompted by Woodruff's report, a new and much more thorough investigation was launched under Detective Assuming Bernard Possells. This phase of the inquiry displayed a meticulousness previously absent. Authorities exhumed Kathleen Grundy's body, uncovering definitive forensic evidence, a fatal overdose of diamorphine, consistent with Shipman's modus operandi. Further searching uncovered the very typewriter Shipman used to forge that will, a physical link connecting him directly to the crime. Perhaps most telling of Shipman's arrogance and desperation was the examination of his computerized medical records. In a bid to cover his tracks, he had altered digital patient files retroactively, inserting fictional entries to justify deaths. But these digital manipulations bore timestamps and audit trails that investigators could follow, exposing unmistakable tampering. His attempts to manufacture exculpatory evidence only served to confirm his guilt. Beyond the Grundy case, the police expanded their probe to 15 representative deaths, assembling a grim mosaic of deliberate murders concealed by falsified certificates and corrupt records. Each piece of this evidence chipped away at Shipman's veneer of innocence, delivering the irrefutable proof necessary to arrest him on September 7, 1998. Reflecting on these events, the pattern of investigative failure followed by eventual rigorous pursuit highlights 2 crucial lessons. First, the tragic cost of dismissing early warnings, whether from undertakers puzzled by strange death patterns or medical colleagues uneasy with anomalies in paperwork, cannot be overstated. The systemic disbelief that a doctor could be a serial killer delayed intervention, allowing Shipman to continue his killing spree unchecked. Second, the power of concrete, material evidence, like the forged will and the forensic findings, was essential in catalyzing a robust investigation and securing accountability. The case underscores the profound challenge posed by the unthinkability barrier in confronting betrayal by trusted professionals. Without tangible, undeniable proof, suspicions are too easily discounted, especially in institutions built on assumption of good faith. But once evidence became visible and incontrovertible, the full machinery of justice was set in motion. Shipman's arrest marked the turning point where the silent shadow ended and public and legal reckoning began. It was a painstaking process of gathering forensic evidence, correlating patterns, and unraveling falsified records that exposed a gruesome reality that had been hiding in plain sight. This culmination, born from the relentless pursuit of truth by family members like Angela Woodruff and diligent investigators, finally brought one of history's most prolific medical murderers to justice. As we move forward in this story, we will explore the trial that followed and how the accumulated evidence was presented in court, transforming the many silent deaths into a powerful narrative of guilt and accountability. But before we do, it is vital to remember that the closing of the net around Shipman was as much about overcoming the psychological and systemic hurdles of disbelief and procedural failure as it was about the forensic breakthroughs themselves. It was this combination that ultimately sealed his fate. The courtroom in Preston Crown Court became the stage for one of the most high-profile and unsettling trials in British history, beginning in October 1999 and concluding in early 2000. Here, the man once trusted by hundreds of patients, Dr. Harold Shipman, faced the full weight of the law. Charged with the murders of 15 of his patients, victims ranging widely in age but predominantly elderly women, Shipman confronted a meticulously constructed prosecution case that revealed the disturbing pattern of his crimes and the calculated methods he employed to evade detection. The charges were grave. 15 counts of murder, each linked to the administration of lethal doses of diamorphine, a strong opiate, and a single count of forgery connected to the falsification of Kathleen Grundy's will, his final victim. The prosecution's strategy to focus on these 15 representative cases was deliberate, offering a manageable yet compelling narrative illustrating the systematic nature of Shipman's crimes. The case of Kathleen Grundy was particularly notable. A wealthy widow and former mayoress, her suspicious death and the crude, almost amateurish, forged will that left her entire estate to Shipman broke the veneer of secrecy that had so far shielded him. Victim family members and witnesses came forward with powerful testimonies. Most impactful was Angela Woodruff, Kathleen Grundy's daughter, whose legal expertise and dogged determination had been central to exposing the forged will and triggering the police investigation. Her testimony described the shock and disbelief at the sudden and suspicious changes to her mother's will, followed by her urgent quest for truth. Relatives of other victims added their voices, recounting details of Shipman's unsettling behavior around the time their loved ones died, painting a picture of manipulation and betrayal behind the professional facade. Expert analysis played a crucial role in dismantling Shipman's defenses. Handwriting experts unequivocally confirmed the forgery of Grundy's will. Digital forensic experts explained how Shipman had tried, and failed, to conceal his crimes within the computerized medical record system by backdating entries and falsifying symptoms, actions betrayed by traceable digital footprints and timestamps. Toxicologists presented evidence of lethal diamorphine overdoses found in the exhumed bodies of several victims. The prosecution demonstrated a consistent modus operandi. Shipman would administer a fatal injection during trusted home visits, then confirm a natural cause of death on certificates he personally signed, and finally manipulate medical records to support this false narrative. Throughout the trial, Shipman's courtroom demeanor was unsettling. Where one might expect contrition or at least humility, he instead displayed arrogance and unyielding denial. His responses were marked by haughty defiance and frequently shifting stories, behaviors that earned him little sympathy. His attempts to dismiss or dispute forensic evidence often fell flat, and this stubborn denial contrasted sharply with the weight of the meticulous case assembled against him. Observers noted his lack of remorse and the chilling absence of empathy for the victims and their families represented in the court. The defense, while attempting to argue for Shipman's innocence or to cast doubt on the evidence, ultimately failed to counter the overwhelming prosecution case. The mounting forensic proof, corroborated by compelling eyewitness accounts and the clear financial motive established by the forged will, left little room for reasonable doubt. Efforts to separate the forgery charge from the murder accusations were unsuccessful, as the prosecution underscored the crucial link between the two. The forgery was not merely an isolated crime but part of the broader tapestry of Shipman's deceit and lethal ambition. After nearly 4 months of trial proceedings and 6 days of jury deliberation, the verdict came on January 31, 2000. Harrowing and definitive, the jury found Harold Shipman guilty of all 15 counts of murder and the 1 count of forgery. The verdict marked a powerful moment of justice, an affirmation of the painstaking work to bring to light the extent of his crimes. Mr. Justice Forbes, presiding over the case, handed down a life sentence for each murder, with a recommendation that Shipman serve a whole life tariff, meaning he would never be released. The severity of the sentence reflected both the gravity of the crimes and the judge's recognition of Shipman's extraordinary betrayal of trust. For the forgery charge related to Kathleen Grundy's will, Shipman received a concurrent sentence of 4 years. The whole life tariff was later officially confirmed by the Home Secretary, signaling the state's firm stance against any possibility of Shipman returning to society. The day after sentencing, the General Medical Council struck Shipman off the medical register, formally ending his medical career. This act was both symbolic and practical. It removed any remaining professional legitimacy from a man who had so egregiously violated the fundamental tenets of medicine. The justice system, confronted with crimes of exponential scale and moral turpitude, struggled to fully grapple with the enormity of Shipman's actions. While this trial focused on a fraction of his victims, it was clear that the legal process had reached its practical limits. Prosecutors chose not to pursue additional charges for suspected further murders. The reasoning was pragmatic. The life sentences rendered further convictions unnecessary in terms of punishment, and the potential for media saturation and jury bias around any subsequent trials threatened the possibility of fair hearings. Yet, for the families of untried victims, the absence of individual criminal proceedings left a lingering sense of incomplete closure. The trial and conviction of Harold Shipman closed one dark chapter in British criminal history but opened another, one of reflection, scrutiny, and reform. It spotlighted a justice system that, though challenged by the complexity and scale of such crimes, ultimately delivered a measure of accountability. It underscored the painstaking process required to transform suspicion into legal proof and the crucial roles of victim families, expert witnesses, and meticulous investigation. As the court doors closed on Shipman's trial, the broader societal reckoning was just beginning, a reckoning with the systemic failures that allowed a trusted doctor to become one of history's most prolific serial killers. The conviction was a hard-won victory for justice, but it was also a somber milestone reminding us of the profound vulnerabilities in human systems and the lasting need for vigilance in protecting the most vulnerable from those who would betray them. From this point, the narrative would move beyond the courtroom to examine the inquiry and reforms spurred by the Shipman case, aiming to prevent any echo of such a betrayal in the future. In the aftermath of Harold Shipman's conviction, the true magnitude of his crimes and the systemic failures that let him persist prompted the launch of what would become one of the most exhaustive public inquiries in British medical history. The Shipman Inquiry, established in 2000 just a day after Shipman was found guilty, set out with a singular mission: to uncover not only the extent of Shipman's killings, but to rigorously examine the medical, regulatory, and institutional systems that enabled such a reign of terror to unfold under the guise of care. This monumental investigation was no mere formality. Over its unprecedented 5-year duration, the inquiry undertook a colossal task, collecting approximately 2,500 witness statements and reviewing nearly 270,000 pages of evidence. Its 6 comprehensive reports together ran to some 5,000 pages, revealing painstaking detail about every facet of the case and its wider implications, with the costs exceeding £20 million. The scale alone underscores the seriousness with which the UK government and public demanded answers and accountability. At the heart of the inquiry's findings was a chilling reassessment of Shipman's murderous span. While the trial had culminated in his conviction for 15 patient murders, The inquiry concluded that the true death toll was closer to 250 victims, a staggering figure covering a career of nearly 3 decades, starting as early as 1971. This revision was based on meticulous analysis of death statistics, exhumations, toxicology reports, and medical record examinations, painting a grim picture of sustained, systematic killing. The inquiry acknowledged even that number could be conservative, with some estimates suggesting up to 260 lives ended at his hand. This not only redefined Shipman's legacy as one of history's most prolific serial killers, but also highlighted the profound failure of multiple safeguards intended to protect patients. Central to understanding how Shipman could operate so long is the inquiry's illuminating scrutiny of systemic vulnerabilities across healthcare and medical oversight. Foremost among these was the role of the General Medical Council (GMC), charged with regulating doctors and safeguarding patient welfare. The inquiry's critique was scathing. It found that the GMC operated within a culture that prioritized protecting doctors' careers and reputations over patient safety. This was glaringly evident decades earlier when Shipman's conviction for forging prescriptions and drug addiction in the mid-1970s was treated as a regrettable mistake rather than a danger sign. The GMC's decision to merely warn and fine him, rather than remove him from practice, was later branded a grave error by the inquiry. This leniency effectively allowed a man with clear evidence of deceit and addiction back into a position of trust where he could continue and escalate his killings. Other key systemic failings included serious flaws in death and cremation certification processes. Shipman exploited weak oversight in these areas by certifying deaths himself, often without any independent review or scrutiny. Because many of his victims were elderly and died in circumstances plausible as natural deaths, his falsified death certificates went largely unquestioned. Cremation forms, which require counter-signatures to confirm cause of death legitimacy, were similarly vulnerable. Shipman pressured families and medical colleagues alike to facilitate this process without raising alarms. The inquiry pointed to these procedural weaknesses as critical enablers of his crimes. The monitoring and control of dangerous drugs formed another weak link. Shipman's weapon of choice was diamorphine, a powerful opiate generally reserved for palliative care. Yet systems designed to track and regulate such controlled substances were inadequate. The inquiry demonstrated that Shipman was able to obtain and administer lethal doses without triggering suspicion, in part due to poor auditing and lax enforcement around prescriptions and drug inventories. This underscored how gaps in pharmaceutical oversight, combined with a practitioner's privileged access, could be deadly. Perhaps most notably, the inquiry highlighted the structural dangers of isolated general practice, particularly single-handed GPs like Shipman who operated with minimal peer oversight. Once he established his solo practice in Hyde in 1992, the absence of colleagues who might notice irregularities in patient deaths, prescriptions, or administrative records gave him unprecedented freedom. The isolated environment amplified the risk of undetected wrongdoing. The inquiry described this as a systemic weakness, emphasizing that isolated practitioners must be subject to more rigorous and regular scrutiny to prevent similar future abuses. Beyond pinpointing Shipman's exploitation of these failings, the inquiry drew a broader, sobering conclusion. These were not isolated loopholes exploited by a single rogue doctor, but rather endemic structural weaknesses in how the UK's healthcare system monitored, regulated, and safeguarded patient welfare. It underscored a culture among medical regulators and professionals that often protected the interests and reputations of doctors at the cost of patient safety. The inquiry warned that this cultural complacency was arguably more dangerous than any procedural flaw. Dame Janet Smith, the inquiry's chair, poignantly noted that responsibility extended beyond Shipman alone. It was a collective failure of the medical profession, regulatory bodies, law enforcement, and governmental oversight that created fertile ground for Shipman's prolonged spree. She stressed that all doctors, and not general practitioners alone, bore some measure of accountability for the conditions that permitted such a catastrophic breach of trust. The Shipman inquiry's revelations shattered assumptions rooted not only in the specific case but across the culture of medical practice and trust. What emerged was a comprehensive blueprint of vulnerabilities awaiting exploitation and a call for profound reform. The depth of systemic neglect laid bare indicated that without urgent, wide-reaching change, similar tragedies could recur. This exhaustive investigation and its findings drew the world's attention to the dark shadows where betrayal of trust can hide, masked by professional authority, procedural weaknesses, and institutional reticence. It forced a reckoning on the balance between trusting healthcare professionals and maintaining vigilant oversight. At its conclusion, the inquiry's catalogue of failures served not simply as an indictment of past mistakes but as a crucial foundation to rebuild a safer, more transparent, and accountable healthcare system. As we move forward in this story, the consequences of these failures, and the reforms they sparked, become the lens through which the broader legacy of Harold Shipman will be understood. This is a cautionary tale not only of one man's extraordinary evil, but of how entrenched institutional weaknesses allowed evil to flourish undetected for nearly 30 years. The Shipman inquiry stands as a pivotal chapter exposing those shadows, compelling a system-wide awakening to ensure such monstrous neglect and exploitation never happens again. The question that haunts the darkest corners of the Harold Shipman saga is the mystery of why a trusted doctor would turn into one of history's most prolific killers. Without a confession, without a word from Shipman himself about his motives, we are left to piece together the echoes of a fractured mind from the patterns, the whispers of behavior, and the chilling methods he employed. Understanding his psychological landscape requires a journey beneath the surface, into theories that experts have hypothesized to explain the unthinkable. At the heart of many explanations lies the notion of power, a twisted hunger for absolute control over life and death. To truly grasp this, we must remember that a doctor holds profound authority, a social and moral responsibility that commands both respect and trust. But Shipman's actions suggest a man who transformed that responsibility into a perverse playground of dominance. The common theory is that he derived a cruel satisfaction from wielding ultimate power, determining the fate of those who placed their lives in his care. Killing was not merely an act but a demonstration of control, a way to exert influence where none should exist. This thirst for power manifested in a clinical, sometimes chillingly detached manner, as he chose his victims, timed their deaths, and manipulated the records to maintain his facade. Closely tied to this craving for control is the psychological construct sometimes referred to as a God complex. In Shipman's case, some experts suggest that he saw himself as the arbiter of life and death, a deity wielding divine judgment over his patients. This self-assigned godlike role affirms narcissistic tendencies, an exaggerated sense of importance and superiority. Unlike instances of mercy killing or euthanasia, Shipman's victims were not all suffering or terminally ill. Many were relatively healthy elderly individuals. The God complex theory suggests a pathological need to dominate, rationalizing actions not as humane but as extensions of his own sense of infallibility. It is a dark delusion where he became judge, jury, and executioner, arrogantly overriding the natural course of life without accountability. Another compelling theory proposes that Shipman was addicted to killing. This idea, supported by Dame Janet Smith of the Shipman Inquiry, views his compulsions as self-reinforcing behaviors akin to a psychological dependency. Just as substance addiction demands increasing amounts for satisfaction, Shipman's murders escalated in frequency and boldness. He may have found a perverse pleasure or psychological high in the act itself, beyond motives of gain or relief, which drove him to kill repeatedly. The ritual of lethal doses, the secret injections, the pattern of control, it became a process that fed his darker urges. The escalation in his killings during the 1990s supports this, reflecting the concept of tolerance and compulsive repetition found in addictive behavior. Perhaps most poignantly, Shipman's twisted narrative is interwoven with the shadow of his mother's painful death. At 17, he watched his mother suffer from lung cancer, witnessing morphine administration intended to ease her agony. This harrowing experience may have laid a traumatic psychological template, imprinting a distorted association between care, death, and control. Some psychologists argue that Shipman engaged in a pathological form of repetition compulsion, a psychological drive to replay unresolved trauma in an unconscious attempt to master it. In his killings, predominantly of elderly women, there may have been a morbid attempt to exert control over death, a reenactment of the helplessness he witnessed but could never influence during his mother's decline. This repetition, far from healing, instead manifested as a harmful compulsion with devastating consequences. While some early theories speculated about misguided euthanasia, that Shipman thought himself to be relieving suffering or sparing burdens, this notion quickly loses ground when one considers the health and vitality of many of his victims. The pattern simply does not support a merciful rationale. Many patients were not terminally ill, and his killings were neither uniform nor medically justifiable. The absence of genuine compassion amidst his actions underscores the difference between mercy and malevolence. Harold Shipman's psychological profile is further complicated by his traits as a manipulative and determined medical psychopath. Psychopathy involves a constellation of traits: lack of empathy, superficial charm, deceitfulness, and a profound ability to manipulate social and professional relationships. Shipman embodied these in ways that enabled him to craft a convincing facade of a caring, diligent doctor, while simultaneously harboring lethal intent. His capacity to deceive colleagues, patients, and families for decades reveals an extraordinary skill in concealment combined with a cold and calculating detachment from human suffering. The internal landscape of Shipman's mind was one of profound disconnect. To many, he appeared the benevolent caregiver, but beneath that surface was a man marked by contradictions, charming yet cruel, trustworthy yet duplicitous, attentive yet callous. This duality, a nearly Jekyll and Hyde persona, allowed him to navigate social expectations skillfully while compartmentalizing his dark urges. Some who knew him described moments of unpleasant arrogance and mood swings, evidence of an underlying turbulence that belied the outer composure he displayed to his victims. As his killings escalated, one notes a recklessness creeping into his actions, a growing inability to contain his compulsions or to maintain the subtleties of disguise. This loss of control over his murderous impulses paralleled many serial offenders who experience a breakdown of inhibition over time. The brazen act of forging Kathleen Grundy's will, an act so crude it exposed him, suggests either a desperate gamble or a subconscious drive to be caught, a fatal misstep in the intricate game he played with death and deception. In sum, the psychological portrait of Harold Shipman reveals a man consumed by the need for power, a pathological compulsion to kill, deeply shaped by personal trauma, and tempered by psychopathic traits that enabled sustained deception. His crimes were not random acts of violence, but a dark manifestation of a tortured mind that turned the sacred trust of medicine into an instrument of evil. Through this nuanced lens, we glimpse the profound psychological darkness that fueled his reign of terror, an abyss hidden behind the mask of the trusted doctor. As we reflect on this chilling psychological landscape, we prepare to explore the far-reaching impact of Shipman's crimes, the shattered families, the fractured communities, and the enduring echoes of betrayal that continue to reverberate. Understanding the mind behind the murders is only part of the story. The human toll and the collective aftermath are the shadows that stretch far beyond the chilling acts themselves. The horror wrought by Harold Shipman did not end with the cold statistics of his victims. The true depth of his crimes is revealed in the shattered lives of those left behind, families who wrestled not only with grief, but with a crushing sense of betrayal and unimaginable trauma. This is the human story behind the numbers, a story of profound loss and a community's wounded soul. Among the most poignant accounts is that of Patricia Powell, whose quick instincts spared her mother from Shipman's deadly reach. In 1998, just months before his arrest, Patricia found herself in a painfully surreal moment, accompanying her mother during a medical consultation that could have ended in tragedy. Sensing something deeply wrong with Shipman, Patricia refused to leave her mother alone in the doctor's presence. She challenged Shipman's intention to administer medication, a rare moment of courage amid the trust that the community had invested in him for decades. Her mother survived, but Patricia's experience left an indelible scar. She has since expressed a deep, lasting distrust in doctors, a sentiment echoed by many who felt that the betrayal pierced not just their hearts but their fundamental sense of safety in the healthcare system. This personal story is echoed across Hyde and beyond, where the reverberations of Shipman's crimes inflicted widespread psychological wounds that lingered long after his arrest. Families not only mourned their loved ones but grappled with the incomprehensible reality that the person they trusted with their lives had been the architect of their deaths. This betrayal cut to the core of their relationships with medicine and those sworn to protect them. The impact on surviving patients and community members was equally profound. Those who had direct or indirect contact with Shipman spoke candidly of an eerie duality. Many recalled his outward charm and attentiveness, but others revealed glimpses of a darker nature, a man who could be arrogant, nasty, or radiate an unsettling aura. Such dissonant impressions sowed suspicion and fear, complicating perceptions and making it harder for anyone to fully comprehend who he truly was. The unsettling awareness that peril had lurked in the guise of a trusted healer instilled a collective unease that shadowed Hyde for years. The town itself endured a collective terror. Residents lived with a new and painful reality. Medical care, a fundamental pillar of well-being, could no longer be taken at face value. This fear was palpable. Many were too frightened to visit doctors or clinic appointments even for routine care. The community's shaken faith reflected a broader societal anxiety about the trustworthiness of medical professionals. If Shipman, the quintessential family doctor, could violate the sacred doctor-patient relationship so utterly, then how could anyone feel safe? The Shipman case detonated that question with brutal force, exposing a vulnerability no one dared consider before. Indeed, Shipman's legacy extends far beyond those he directly harmed. His crimes triggered an unsettling shift in public consciousness, fostering a climate of wariness and skepticism toward healthcare providers across the country. The once almost absolute trust in doctors was firmly compromised. Now, patients and their families had to confront a new reality, one where vigilance and doubt have a place alongside faith in medical care. The psychological ramifications within the community ripple on. The grief of loss intermingled with a profound sense of injustice and violation. Many families continue to live with the trauma of knowing their loved ones' deaths were not natural but counterfeit, a horrific act disguised as medical care. This betrayal undermined their ability to trust not only the medical profession but also the systems meant to safeguard them. The very fabric of communal faith was torn. It is important to recognize that the damage extended beyond individual families. Entire networks, neighbors, friends, and healthcare workers found themselves grappling with how to process and heal from a trauma so vast and insidious. The collective shadow of Shipman's reign of terror imposed a heavy burden on Hyde and the wider public, who had to confront uncomfortable truths about vulnerability, safety, and trust. This segment of the story affirms that the consequences of Shipman's crimes cannot be measured only in lives lost or courts convened. They reside equally in the lasting psychological scars borne by survivors, families, and communities, in the shattered sense of security once taken for granted, and in a medical profession forever marked by internal reflection and external skepticism. The ripples of horror extend infinitely outward, touching individual hearts, shaking entire communities, and challenging a nation's foundational belief in the sanctity and safety of healthcare. As we move forward to understand the aftermath, the reforms, the inquiry, and the enduring vigilance born from this tragedy, it is vital to remember the human cost. Behind every statistic is a story of love, loss, and the quest for justice in the wake of betrayal. This is the legacy that Harold Shipman left behind, a somber reminder that the shadows cast by evil often reach far beyond the immediate victims, coloring lives and communities in sorrow and unease for generations to come. The horrific case of Harold Shipman sent shockwaves not only through the town of Hyde but across the entire United Kingdom, exposing vulnerabilities in the medical system that allowed a trusted doctor to kill hundreds of patients undetected. In the aftermath of this unprecedented betrayal, the necessity for profound change became glaringly evident. What followed was a sweeping overhaul of medical regulation and patient safety designed to prevent such a horror from ever recurring. One of the most critical areas targeted for reform was the control of dangerous and controlled substances. Shipman exploited the lack of stringent measures around the prescription and dispensing of powerful opioids like diamorphine. In response, new, far tighter controls were established. These included a national inspectorate specifically tasked with monitoring the use and audit trails of controlled drugs. Doctors convicted of drug offenses were now restricted from prescribing these substances to themselves or family members. Every movement of controlled substances had to be accounted for, creating a far more transparent and accountable system. These measures aimed to close the gaps that Shipman had so easily slipped through for years. Death certification, another cornerstone of Shipman's deceit, was radically reformed. Previously, the ability for a single doctor to sign off on a death certificate with minimal oversight had allowed Shipman to falsify causes of death without scrutiny. New protocols introduced the role of medical examiners who review deaths independently before certification, ensuring that deaths are verified with greater care. Attempts were also made to unify death certification processes for both burials and cremations, introducing a standardized, more rigorous approach to verifying natural causes versus suspicious deaths. The General Medical Council (GMC), the body charged with policing doctors' professional conduct, faced withering criticism in the wake of Shipman's crimes. It had prioritized protecting doctors' interests over patient safety, notably failing to sufficiently act on Shipman's early drug offenses. To address this, the GMC underwent significant structural reforms. More lay members, those without medical backgrounds, were added to its council and disciplinary panels to enhance transparency and reflect public concerns better. The GMC's procedures were overhauled to increase accountability, reduce possible bias towards doctors, and improve responsiveness to complaints or suspicions. The coroner's system, responsible for investigating deaths, was also overhauled. Prior to the reforms, lapses in coroner's training and inconsistent procedures left gaps that Shipman exploited. New standards and training requirements were implemented to help coroners better recognize suspicious deaths and to manage investigations more effectively. This included improving communication between coroners, medical professionals, and law enforcement to ensure no warning signs go unnoticed. Another cornerstone of reform targeted the ongoing monitoring of doctors. The introduction of mandatory annual appraisals combined with a rigorous, 5-yearly revalidation system aimed to ensure continuous verification of a doctor's fitness to practice. This was intended to catch behavioral changes, professional lapses, or warning signs early, rather than relying solely on retrospective complaints or investigations. Outcomes from these appraisals are now reported to the GMC, adding an additional layer of oversight. Patient complaints and whistleblowing systems were dramatically improved in response to the cultural flaws uncovered in Shipman's case. Previously, many patients found it difficult to raise concerns, while healthcare staff feared reprisals for speaking out about colleagues. Reforms created clearer, more accessible pathways for complaints and fortified protections for whistleblowers. Encouraging transparency and safeguarding those who voice suspicions aimed to build a culture where raising concerns is normalized and taken seriously. Despite the breadth and depth of these reforms, however, debates continue over their effectiveness. Critics argue that some systems, such as doctor appraisal and revalidation, risk becoming mere bureaucratic tick-box exercises without meaningful impact on patient safety. They observe that a determined and devious individual like Shipman might still exploit loopholes or manipulate systems designed for honest practitioners. The tragic reality is that no regulatory system can guarantee absolute prevention of such evil. This recognition underscores the need for constant vigilance, not only from regulatory bodies but from patients, families, colleagues, and all who interact with healthcare providers. The Shipman saga teaches us that trust, while essential in medicine, must always be tempered with a healthy skepticism and a readiness to question anomalies. The courage of those like Angela Woodruff, who refused to accept easy answers in the face of suspicious circumstances, and Dr. Linda Reynolds, who spoke out despite professional risks, were instrumental in ending Shipman's spree. Their vigilance reminds us that human awareness and determination remain among the strongest defenses against betrayal. Ultimately, the Shipman case is a stark and somber reminder that horrific treachery can occur even within the most trusted professions. It teaches that systems, no matter how robust, can be circumvented or delayed by denial and complacency. This tragedy compels a commitment to ongoing awareness, reform, and education so that future victims are better protected. As this episode draws to a close, it leaves us with a crucial call to action. To honor those who lost their lives, we must remain informed, vigilant, and proactive in questioning and safeguarding the care entrusted to us. The legacy of Harold Shipman is a shadow looming over medicine, but it is also a catalyst driving essential change aimed at ensuring that the sacred trust between doctor and patient is preserved, respected, and protected for generations to come.